event, this conference is live-streamed via YouTube without an in-house audience. COVID-19 is still grappling the world and does not allow us to have a traditional conference format. So, this conference is somewhat of a hybrid, with panelists gathered here at IFES Chungsan Hall and one additional presenter zoomed in each session. The presentations from abroad have been pre-recorded, but the presenter will be available live for the Q&A session. COVID-19 has impacted countries around the world. North Korea was the first one to completely shut its borders. Contact with the outside world has been reduced to an absolute minimum. We do not see much progress in US-North Korea talks or in inter-Korean engagement. Other incidents have heightened tensions on the peninsula, most notably the recent killing of a South Korean citizen near the northern limit line. The situation on the Korean peninsula is complicated. In light of the developments of the past year, this conference aims to address the difficulties of dealing with North Korea in the COVID-19 world. Our first session will address the broader political setting of a COVID-19 world and how relations of North Korea in such a world have to be re-evaluated. Our second session will address possible venues for engagement with North Korea and how we can now prepare the base for potential future exchanges. Before we begin, let me kindly invite Director of IFES, Dr. Lee Kwon-se, who will provide some opening remarks.
안녕하세요.
Hello everyone. I am Kwon-se Lee, Director of IFES. We are co-hosting with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation this conference under the theme North Korea International Re-evaluating, Reviewing, and Reconnecting in a COVID World, and it is a great pleasure to be holding this event. IFES and FNF has been carrying out conferences for more than 10 years now on various topics. And it is the very first time that our two organizations are hosting this conference without participants and streaming this conference live via YouTube. As you are well aware, COVID-19 has led to dramatic changes in all areas across the world. And these changes will be unfolding continuously, and we are truly living in an uncertain era, which is leading to heightened interest and a lot of research in what COVID-19 will lead to. Inter-Korean relations and also North Korea is experiencing various changes as well, and we have many challenges ahead of us that need to be tackled. So, as we are looking toward post-COVID-19, I think it is important for us to review and re-evaluate what needs to be reviewed once more. And I think it would be meaningful for us to reconsider many things. We need to re-evaluate inter-Korean relations and DPRK. We should assess how COVID influenced the inter-Korean relations and DPRK and what we can expect in the future. Not only inter-Korean relations, but foreign affairs and cooperation and ties with other countries. From all of these perspectives, we need to think about COVID-19 and how it will impact these various areas. And this is something that we need to do. And COVID-19 may lead to various issues in the future. And therefore, this is a topic that needs to be discussed. I believe that it is very timely that we are holding this conference. And I know that the experts and scholars gathered here today are very busy due to their busy schedules, and yet they have come here to give their ideas and thoughts on this very important issue. And I think it is very important that we gather these ideas together and assessments together in order to forecast the future. Once again, I would like to thank FNF Korea office and IFES, and FNF will continuously carry out conferences as today, and there will be many complications due to the situation, but I'm sure that the presentations will be very insightful, and we can discuss many alternatives through in-depth discussions. And once again, I would like to thank those watching via YouTube and the participants for taking time out of their busy schedule. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I now kindly ask Dr. Christian Tarks, head of the Korea office of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, to provide some welcoming remarks.
I better take my glasses. 안녕하십니까? Dear Professor Lee Kwan-se, Director of the Institute for Far Eastern Studies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking into a rather empty room today, which is a big difference to what we used to have, but as Professor Yi just pointed out, it won't be less intensive than we have been used to that for so many years now. Let me welcome all of you on behalf of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom to this conference we are hosting together with the Institute of Far Eastern Studies, IFES. My special thanks go to the IFES and its Director Lee for organizing today's event with us, so I only can give you back these kind words you gave to me. Thank you very much, Professor Yi. Our two institutions have been closely cooperating even since 2008. For those to whom we are not familiar, we are a small but very nice political foundation from Germany. Allow me to give some brief remarks on what our institution, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, stands for. We are an independent German non-profit organization which was established in 1958. Our philosophy is to promote liberal ideas which comprise individual freedom and responsibility, market economy, the rule of law, and human rights. Today, more than 60 years after we were founded, we have projects in about 70 countries worldwide, and we are very happy to be in this country as well. The foundation opened its office here in Seoul in 1987, capitalizing on our own experience with the German unification in 1989. And by the way, last weekend we celebrated the 30th anniversary of German reunification, so it was a very nice weekend for us Germans all over the world. We tried to promote dialogue and cooperation between South and North Korea. For more than 15 years, Naumann Foundation has fostered knowledge exchange and engagement with North Korea. We have been providing both theoretical and practical trainings for experts from different fields on site in Pyongyang since 2003. Our programs focus on water resource management and sustainable development in the North and include study tours to Germany for North Koreans. The last one of those ended last October, the 2nd. I will remember that day until we have renewed opportunities to work with North Korea very well. In our long experience with North Korea, we have seen many ups and downs. The years 2016 and 2017 were grave times, but in 2018, I like to think back of that time, unprecedented diplomatic efforts took place. Unfortunately, since then, we witnessed the breakdown of relations after the failure of the Hanoi summit. And now, since the beginning of this year, Corona is making any cooperation impossible. We hope that this might change, well, in the near future, as near as any possible. The division of the Korean Peninsula has been ongoing for over 70 years, and no easy solution exists. We have discussed it several times in this room already, but we keep on discussing that. The route ahead will not be easy. Nevertheless, for us, there is no alternative to dialogue and engagement. Thus, it is of utmost importance to find ways to engage and to bring together scholars of different fields to share their insights and develop new ideas. The coronavirus is one of the biggest challenges the international community has seen in modern times. North Korea has completely shut its borders, being more isolated than ever to protect itself against the coronavirus. So how can we adjust our policy to such a new political environment, a COVID-19 world? How can we establish connections and find ways to engage and connect with an even more isolated North Korea? Before COVID-19 came, we always thought, well, more isolated is not really possible. It is, as we have learned since last January 30. It is a great honor to gather such renowned experts here today to discuss the global changing political environment of a COVID-19 world, how it impacts our policies towards North Korea, and how we can rethink engagement in times like these. I'm convinced that this conference will help us to shed some light on the current situation in the country and expand our understanding how engagement with North Korea has a chance to succeed. Thank you very much again for organizing, for contributing. Thank you very much, Professor Yi, and thank you to all the participants out there. We're trying out this new format, but I'm optimistic that we will be successful with that. Thank you for your attention. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tags. And now I give the floor to Professor Hwang Ji-won, who chairs the first session, North Korea International, Re-evaluating Relations and Sanctions.
Thank you, Tim. This is Ji-won Hwang, and I teach international relations and North Korea at the University of Seoul. It's my honor to moderate this first session. The first session topic is the North Korea International Re-evaluating Relations and Sanctions. Actually, we have 4 presentations, and we don't have the designated discussion. So after the finishing our 4 presentations, I will moderate the discussion, and I try to encourage for the panelists to participate in the active discussion. First of all, I would like to introduce the 5 preeminent presenters. The first presentation will be by the Professor Kim Tae-kyung and Gu Ga-bu. Professor Kim Tae-kyung is currently a research professor at the University of North Korea Studies, and Professor Gu Ga-bu is a professor of political science at the University of North Korea Studies here. Second presenter is the Dr. Jun Park. Jun Park is a political economist. She is now at the East Asia Voices Initiative Fellow of the East Asia National Research Center at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. And third presenter is Professor Leif Erik Easley. He is now the Associate Professor of International Studies at the Ewha Women's University. Our fourth presenter is the June participant. She's now in Germany, and she will participate here at the June platform. And she's Dr. Teresa Novotná, and she's now the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at Free University Berlin. So today we have a very tight schedule, and so without further ado, we need to start our presentation. First presentations by Professor Kim Tae-kyung and Kuga Woo. You have 15 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Hwang. I'm Tae-kyung Kim, a research professor at the University of North Korean Studies. It's a very great honor to be here and participate in this panel hosted by both Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom and Institute of Far Eastern Studies at Gyeongnam University. Professor Kuga Woo and I co-worked on this presentation, and I'll give you the presentation first, and Professor Koo will participate in the discussion too. Our presentation title is Rebuilding Relations and Diplomacy with North Korea in a COVID-19 World, Challenges and Prospects. You might wonder whose relations and diplomacy with North Korea we're talking here. In the presentation, we'll cover 3 areas regarding that question shortly, and after surveying North Korea's pandemic responses. Our primary focus here is on the prospect of North Korea's future national strategies, which we think is essential to acknowledge to push forward relations and diplomacy with North Korea post-COVID. So here's the outline of presentation. I'm going to talk in some length about the North Korea's pandemic responses so far. For that, we will introduce the concept of the quarantine state, which we propose for explaining every state's missions during and after the pandemic. And I'll talk about the impact of the COVID-19 to 3 areas of context and interactions with North Korea. First is the diplomacy with North Korea, and here we focus on the cases of countries that opened embassies in North Korea. Second is the humanitarian works continued by UN agencies and NGOs in the field. And the third is the relations of neighboring countries with North Korea. Then I'll move on to the prospects of North Korea's national strategies to survive in a COVID world, and add a few words in the end on at what areas we should focus on to rebuild relations with North Korea. First, what was North Korea's pandemic responses and how much changes in the nation's strategies and policies occurred compared to pre-COVID-19? As one way to answer this question, we come up with the concept of quarantine state, which we think captures every state's missions during and after the COVID. We define a quarantine state to be a state that puts number 1 priority to effective anti-epidemic during the crisis. What we highlight here is that the COVID pandemic has impacted and reorganized the state's role, particularly in terms of saving people's lives, health, and safety in the emergencies. That doesn't change the basic rules of the previous global order, where territorial states are major actors, but what we're suggesting here is that the pandemic results in changes to the ways the competence of states are evaluated, and thereby impacting the ways they compete. Economic recovery after the pandemic is expected slow. Without vaccines, treatments, or even with them, the measures like social distancing and online meetings like we are having right now will settle down and keep going, and the globalization we had pre-COVID will not return. So I think the pandemic-induced changes in state strategies and policies should be acknowledged and analyzed. From the perspective of this quarantine state, we categorize into 4 types. On the context of the Korean Peninsula, we define 2 different quarantine states types, which are the North Korean type and the South Korean one. Then we also consider other types of quarantine states. We include the US type, the Chinese type, and the European type. Regarding each quarantine state, we point out their characteristics in terms of state measures against the spread of the virus, civil compliance, and economy-related policies. This categorization of types of quarantine states is still in its draft stage, so we might need revisions for a better explanation's sake. For example, the label of the European type can provoke controversies because there have been differences in each state's responses to the pandemic in the EU, including that we are welcoming your comments and thoughts on this table and the concept in the discussion session. From this framework of quarantine state, so what features does the North Korean quarantine state type have? What is commonly pointed out regarding the North Korea's pandemic responses so far is the swiftness and stringency of the measures the state has taken so far. This might explain the state authoritarianism or state totalitarianism of the North Korean type we pointed out earlier. North Korea established the national scale system to fight against the COVID as early as January 24th, when the non-standing Central Committee of People's Public Health Care Guidance declared the state emergency anti-epidemic system in accordance to the law of anti-epidemics. Then that law was also revised during the pandemic to ensure effective anti-epidemic works. More importantly, the changes in priorities in face of the pandemic have been publicly acknowledged in the primary party and government meetings. For example, in the April meeting of the Supreme People's Assembly, a new state budget for next year increased the quota of public health care while freezing the national defense. Especially with the triple sets of crises, which is a combination of the sanctions, the COVID, and the damages due to the flood and typhoons, the recent plenary meeting of the party's Central Committee in August confirmed in a self-critical way the severity of the unprecedented crisis and the failures to rightly adapt to the changing environment, and they decided to draft a new national development plan in next year's party Congress. So how much changes did occur in engaging with North Korea during the pandemic crisis? I'll talk about this in three slides. First, we saw withdrawals of all diplomats from North Korea after the COVID broke out. Most recently, Sweden's staff, including the ambassador, left Pyongyang after reports of difficulties to continue diplomatic activities due to the pandemic. Since March, when the month-long quarantine of foreigners lifted, most foreigners left the country. Here included the diplomats from Germany, France, and Switzerland. Britain also left North Korea in late May. Because of the stringent measures the state imposed upon both residents and foreigners alike, the diplomatic activities, even daily routines, have been threatened in North Korea. Second, the linkages with North Korea of UN agencies and humanitarian NGOs. These are also went through difficulties, according to the recent reports of IFRC, UNICEF, or other NGOs and UN agencies residents in North Korea. Continuing the previous humanitarian programs plus the COVID aid is very much challenging and time-consuming. Due to the sanctions and problems of logistics and supply chains worsened during the pandemic. Nevertheless, there are also mild hopes, I think, for continuing international cooperation. North Korea is set to report weekly updates to WHO Pyongyang office, according to the Reuters interview with the WHO Pyongyang office coordinator. An urgent COVID aid, including the diagnostic kits, PPEs, and essential medicines have arrived North Korea thanks to UNICEF, IFRC, MSF, and Swiss humanitarian aid. Third, North Korea's relations with the neighboring countries showed mixed records. Between the US and the DPRK, the talks on the denuclearization and peace regime were brought to a halt after no deal in the Hanoi summit in 2019. Without major concessions between both sides, we cannot expect the practical outcomes of the peace talks. During the pandemic, North Korea has kept criticizing the US poor pandemic responses and the behaviors like cutting off the funding to WHO as jeopardizing the global anti-pandemic front. By contrast, the relations of North Korea with China apparently seems very friendly than ever. Their bilateral relations deepened after 5 summits meetings since 2018. China has provided vital COVID aid to North Korea, as it did to other developing states in Asia and Africa. However, the pandemic harshly hit the bilateral trades after North Korea's sealing off of the border, and there could be dreading impacts of the drastically dropped trades to the economy. And the inter-Korean relations are also at a standstill after the Hanoi summit. Recent episodes, including the explosion of the inter-Korean liaison office in Kaesong or the shooting to death of the South Korean citizen on the West Sea, demonstrate the risky bilateral relations, though we have managed to evade the worst scenario yet. Russia was the second humanitarian aid contributor to North Korea in 2019, following South Korea. Last month, Russia also delivered 25,000 tons of wood to North Korea, and according to the reports of UN panel of experts, Russia, along with China, is reportedly an evading route of the sanctions, especially for imports of petroleum. Japan's new Prime Minister Suga showed in September his willingness to meet Kim Jong-un without preconditions and referred to the unreserved abduction of Japanese nationals by North Korea. Whether the stalemate between Tokyo and Pyongyang starts to thaw around the Tokyo Olympics next year is to be seen. And here, I'll talk about the prospects of North Korea's national strategies and add some ideas for rebuilding cooperation with the North. On August 19, North Korea affirmed that the 8th Party Congress would be held in January 2021. From the upcoming Party Congress, we'll see how the North Korean quarantine state establishes the state's overall national strategies, adjust institutions and resources for the purpose of adapting to a COVID world. Among many problems North Korea should tackle to survive amidst the pandemic crisis overlapped with sanctions and natural disasters, we can point out 3 significant challenges. Number 1 would be restarting the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. And number 2, domestic works, including COVID responses and disaster rehabilitation. And lastly, the economic recovery. Let me add last was how to reorganize our approaches to North Korea post-pandemic. We emphasize here human security approaches, since it in at least ending the current COVID pandemic and preventing future ones and responding to climate changes, all neighboring states as well as humanitarian country team and other humanitarian relief networks should cooperate. And this is more so when we think of North Korea as one of the most vulnerable states in the pandemic crisis. And this leads us to seriously reconsider the UN sanctions in the context of post-COVID world. We should also make efforts to induce North Korea in the multilateral international cooperation for climate change, healthcare, disaster risk management, for example. And this initiative of an inclusive regional community of health and environment can contribute to future multilateral talks for peace and security. Even if it does not in short term, we need to attempt to make room for more openness in continuing and rebuilding relations with North Korea, and it should start from preventing humanitarian problems to worsen in North Korea. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kim. It was wonderful, the presentation about the COVID-19 and North Korea. Normally, so we don't have many information about North Korea, and we don't have much about the COVID-19 situation in North Korea, and it was really wonderful. And now we invite second presentation by Dr. Jun Park, and the title is Adapting Sanctions, Blocking Bad Behavior, Facilitating Cooperation. Dr. Park?
Thank you for coming, and thank you for joining in this very important dialogue. My presentation will deal with EU-South Korea cooperation and the means of digital cooperation within the digital realm, rather than just focusing on inter-Korea cooperation and dialogue. The reason why I prepared this presentation is I am a political economist by training. And after COVID-19, there have been several increased attacks on South Korea and the United States, let alone Europe and the United Kingdom, by malicious actors. And even today, there is poised to be an attack on South Korean financial banks. We believe, in the political economy realm, scholars believe that there is a lot to be conducted in terms of cooperation in the digital realm with regard to cyber hacking and cybersecurity issues. So without further ado, I'll go ahead with my slides. Adapting sanctions, blocking bad behavior, facilitating cooperation. So the first picture that you see on the left is the Security Council room at the UN headquarters in New York. The one in the middle is the US Treasury building in Washington, D.C. And of course, on the right is here in South Korea, tracking North Korea's cyber activities. So the overview is pretty simple. I'll go ahead with the background on sanctions, the history of it. Then I will throw the research question of whether we are still ready to counter malicious activities by North Korea in the cyber realm, whereas on the physical side, we're pretty much, we've been doing this for over 15 years now in terms of sanctions. Targeted sanctions-wise, as opposed to comprehensive sanctions, cyber hacking and money laundering are the main issues I would be talking about. Then policy recommendations as to what can be done between South Korea and the European Union and Germany. So the sanctions that we normally address in the news or in the policy realm, they're mainly about UN Security Council resolutions and the actions that the P5 countries within the Security Council take. And they can be divided into various different categories, such as arms embargo, travel ban, assets freeze, correspondent account approvals, refined petroleum products in the case of North Korea, and humanitarian exemption requests, which are vital to keeping the engagement going with regard to humanitarian causes. As you see, from 2006, the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee, pursuant to the resolution 1718, has been very active in pursuing different kinds of sanctions in the categories that I just mentioned above. But as the testimony of Juan Zarate, a former US Treasury official, states in his book, The Treasury's War, the UN sanctions operate as in the Security Council, but the US sanctions are much more powerful and in some ways a lot more having to do with financial sanctions. If you compare the panel of experts reports with the Treasury's reports, you will see that difference. So what has happened in the very early stage of financial sanctions by the US Treasury indicates that there has been move, especially with the case of Banco Delta Asia in 2006, there have been moves by the US Treasury in the beginning to counter malicious financial accounts. And at the time, the cooperation, intra-organizational cooperation between the U.S. Department of State, U.S. Treasury Department, it wasn't really aligned together in order to counter financial accounts and track them. But nowadays, it's not about just banking accounts. It's more about Bitcoins. It's about tracking down the malicious cyber activities that are poised to attack certain financial computer systems that belong to banks, that belong to governments, that belong to several other institutions that are really important to our everyday life. So these are the recent resolutions that were passed, the UN Security Council resolutions under Obama, under Trump, and as you see indicated in the pictures, during the summits, there weren't many tests, missile tests, nuclear tests, but the missile tests began to be reconvened by the North Korean officials. And we have COVID-19 now. It's a little bit uncertain exactly where North Korea is with regard to the pandemic governance, but what's for sure is that the US is also in a big challenge with regard to pandemic governance. So we'll have to see how this unfolds. The research question that I have for you is, are the current existing tools enough? Are they fit for our time? Are they actually countering the measures that are originally mandated by the sanctions that we talk about every day? In the physical realm, maybe yes, but in the cyber realm, maybe not. So when we talk about the sanctions at the UN Security Council level or the Treasury level, when it's about individuals tracking assets, when it's about export restrictions, we're on par with these guidelines. But when it comes to cyber hacking, money laundering, these kinds of issues, the allotment of pages indicated in the panel of experts report is surprisingly small and short in comparison to, say, private cybersecurity firm reports. The way it works at the US Treasury is that initially, when there is a foreign affairs incident and there has to be some actions taken, the National Security Council is convened in the White House. And different actors in various departments of the US government voice their opinions, and it is headed by the president. The president has the leeway to delegate the authority. Usually, so accustomed to looking at the back. So number 4 and 5 here, the OFAC, the Office for Foreign Assets Control at the US Treasury, they are the main actors that are convening these activities in terms of levying sanctions and then carrying them out, detecting malicious activities. The delegation of authority is what's important here in terms of the US Treasury activities by OFAC. More often than not, the president delegates the activities to the US Treasury, and the OFAC is entitled to carry out these actions. However, as of late, during the Trump administration, Donald Trump's Twitter account with tweets that are opposed to the Treasury's moves sometimes have given not so aligned policy signals to the rest of the world, and not just the US government officials, but the rest of the world. And this is a challenge for many policymakers. So when we're discussing cyber hacking, who are we talking about? It's not just China, Russia, but it's also Iran and North Korea. The 4 countries alone take up about 1/3 of all offenses in the cyber realm. And the victims are usually US, United Kingdom, Europe, South Korea, mostly countries in the free world. And if you compare how their activities are in terms of speed, you will see that Russia is the fastest. They can crack within 19 minutes if they intend. North Korea comes second, Cholima, with about 2 hours and 20 minutes per their target. And if we go a little bit deeper into what they're actually looking for, Cholima, they are categorized into several different groups, and the labyrinth, the stardust, these are targeting financial accounts, and the SWIFT system that is required for international financial activities. So if you examine these activities more closely, you can see that it's a very concerted effort by the state of North Korea, and this is a crucial concern that we have to deal with. Recently, the US Treasury, OFAC, has issued an advisory on ransomware. Ransomware meaning targets on financial institutions, government institutions, et cetera, that I earlier on mentioned. And the advisory is not a law or an implementation to be taken care of immediately, but rather a signal to the financial sector to be prepared for these kinds of attacks. Further work can be done by the US Treasury and in terms of law enforcement by the US authorities as well. And there are proactive actions that must be taken by several different government stakeholders, not just South Korea, but many, many. And as I mentioned several times through my presentation up until now, the UN Panel of Experts report falls very short of addressing cyber issues when a plethora of North Korea's actual economic gains derive from the cyber realm. North Korea's laundered amount from 2017 to 19 is roughly around $200 million from cyber alone. And there has to be something done about this. Recently, the FinCEN files. FinCEN is one of the bureaus of the US Treasury, and it tracks every malicious bank transaction that goes through the United States bank accounts. And the FinCEN files have revealed that the North Korean money laundering scheme has been bypassing US banks, roughly for about $174 million. And usually shell companies are used and Chinese actors are involved in the process, and the fact that the Treasury is not taking action and that JP Morgan Chase, which is the biggest bank in the United States by market capitalization, has been involved in this is a wake-up call to a lot of us going into the COVID era, which is basically a contactless economy. And I'll end with this slide. There's one more on policy recommendations. This slide indicates how fragile the countries of the free world have become to malicious attacks in the digital realm. This is just springing from the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of the attacks occurred when the state, local news by country indicated a weakness or a failure in pandemic governance. And the attackers mostly gauged on targeting those during those time periods because they know that the hackers are aware that the state is in chaos. The same has happened in the United States, the same has happened in South Korea, and today is also another one. During Chuseok, there have been several attacks on South Korean financial institutions, but there has been no financial loss to date. So policy recommendations-wise, what should we do in terms of North Korea's sanctions evasion? How to deal with the upgraded art of evasion in the contactless environment? Because now hackers are very much aware that everybody is spending a lot more time online than physically outside, and the online realm becomes much more sophisticated than before. And the first thing I would state is there has to be some concerted effort and cooperation on North Korea's evasion of sanctions in the cyber realm. For all of the parties, the United States, the UK, UN, EU, South Korea, and central banks, they are usually not so open to the discussions on digital currencies. Only China is interested in opening a digital sovereign currency and releasing it. And that has to be monitored very closely when China penetrates into online banking systems with its own digital sovereign currency. That has to be monitored well. Thirdly, the EU has recently announced in September its first ever plan to regulate cryptocurrencies. And I think it would be a great opportunity for South Korea to chime in and to discuss what details could be achieved from the process. The importance here is not just to counter malicious cryptocurrency activities, but to ensure some legal certainty to valid assets, so that there could be activity that is assured by the government, but at the same time countering malicious activities. Then the UN Security Council panel of experts, as I've said repeatedly in this presentation, those reports should focus a lot more on the cyber realm rather than just delegating it to private cybersecurity firms. Then lastly, the US Treasury's FinCEN Bureau should proactively look into the banking routes of North Korea's money laundering schemes that go through the United States, because this is happening just under the nose. So I'll end it there, and I'll pass this over to Leif.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Bach. It was about the sanction on North Korea and how to North Korea respond to the sanction and avoiding sanctions and adapting sanctions. And it seems to me that two presentations has somewhat to do with each other. So it would be great if you two presenters talk to each other when we have the second round of discussion. Let's invite third the presentation by Professor Leif Eric Easley, and the title is Inter-Korean Relation in a COVID World, Re-Evaluating Policy and Prospect. Leif, you have 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Wong. It's a pleasure to join you on stage with such excellent colleagues dealing with a very timely set of topics today. I'm grateful to the organizers for bringing us together safely, despite all the challenges of the pandemic, and I'm grateful to our colleagues and audience joining us online, hopefully in many corners of the world, and I hope that they have a chance to participate with us as well. I appreciate all of your participation. I've actually been asked to cover a lot of ground today because I've got the inter-Korean relations trajectory presentation. And so I'm going to dive right into my slides with hopes of doing my job to cover as much as I've been asked to cover in limited time, and look forward to the questions and answers. So I tried to specify my research and policy-related job here a little bit from the big question of where will inter-Korean relations be headed post-COVID-19 to a little bit more specific question about how can contradictions between accountability and engagement strategies be mitigated. And when I think about that big question, I divide it up into three sets of hypotheses and findings. First, regarding frictions between deterrence and peace, then trade-offs between sanctions enforcement and economic engagement, and finally, tensions between human rights promotion and reconciliation efforts between the two Koreas. And then I'd like to conclude with some thoughts about policy adjustments for the next US administration, possibly, as we approach the election in the United States. This conference really is held at a timely moment because just this weekend we're going to have the October 10th 75th anniversary of the Workers' Party in North Korea, so we expect some developments out of North Korea in the coming weeks, and certainly developments out of the United States in the next month. So first, how does Washington and Seoul military cooperation come into friction with inter-Korean peace initiatives? I'd like to try to really put our finger on this question because it is a politically charged one. And we know that the combined exercises that the US-ROK alliance conducts tend to anger Pyongyang, not just for propaganda reasons, but for reasons that they have to worry about consuming their resources to counter US ROK capabilities and perhaps some maneuvers. And so it's something that puts friction on perhaps the peace initiatives that the two Koreas might be engaging in. But recently, the size and schedule of US ROK exercises have been adjusted to make space for diplomacy. And this has been the case for a couple years now, really since the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And we saw that impressive year of diplomacy in 2018. And most recently, because of the anti-epidemic measures taken because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The problem with this, though, is that by not having full-scale field exercises and by not engaging in the intricate level of US ROK military exercise routines, it risks detracting from the readiness, the interoperability, and the deterrence capacities of the alliance. And it also has slowed down efforts at alliance transformation. We see that because for South Korea, the OPCON transfer, the transfer of wartime operational control, is an important goal, and it's a goal that is difficult to achieve without the previously rigorous exercise schedule. Another way that I think about friction between military cooperation in the alliance and inter-Korean peace initiatives is that some scholars and analysts have alleged that engagement can sometimes undermine efforts at pressure and containment. There have been discussions about the history of the Sunshine Policy, whether despite all its excellent intentions and many achievements, the Sunshine Policy also gave a new lease on life for the North Korean regime, and a North Korean regime that perhaps had the intention of pursuing nuclear weapons all along. More recently, the Singapore summit reduced the pressure of the maximum pressure campaign, really provided something of a green light to China to reestablish its cooperation with Pyongyang, and alleviated the sort of showing of sticks, if you will, toward Pyongyang to incentivize denuclearization. And now we are witnessing some pretty contentious politics in both Washington and Seoul, because there are some in each capital who, shall we say, blame the alliance for other political issues. Perhaps we could even say go as far as scapegoating the alliance, and this can damage alliance coordination. We see this in Seoul when dialogue mechanisms like the USROK Working Group are blamed for getting in the way of inter-Korean progress, and even accusations that the United Nations Command is somehow an obstacle, and we hear some conspiracy theories about the future of the UN Command. Meanwhile, under the Trump administration, there have been extreme financial demands for the Special Measures Agreement renegotiation in support of the U.S. Forces Korea footprint here in South Korea. And these alliance cost-sharing negotiations have become deadlocked. And that obviously affects the strength of the alliance, and we see these in negative interaction with inter-Korean efforts as well. So looking at those sort of ways or hypotheses that we might see the interaction of military efforts and inter-Korean peace efforts, I would make a few tentative findings that I would like to share with you today. First is that low transparency and communication can lead to problems perceiving consequences. And this is really important because escalation, when you have channels of communication open, when hotlines are working, when diplomats are meeting, when militaries are able to reach out to each other, engagement can help prevent unwanted escalation. Because you can avoid the miscommunication, you can show each side that they have a stake in continued cooperation and dialogue, rather than going down the path, and it's going to sometimes be a very dangerous path of military exchange and escalation. Another observation or finding is that I do not believe that the ROK being in charge of the carrot part of the equation and the US taking lead on sticks is a very good division of labor. Sometimes it seems to naturally play out that way, but a good cop, bad cop strategy leaves the US-ROC alliance vulnerable to wedge-driving tactics by North Korea and detracts from the international cooperation that's so important to make not only deterrence but also engagement credible to North Korea. And then finally, under this part of the presentation, I'd point out that sacrificing alliance capabilities and coordination may be putting the cart before the horse, because engaging effectively has to build on security. If you give up exercises, if you give up deterrence capacity, if you give up some security strengths on the faith that hopefully engagement will pay off very quickly, it is a real risk, because you won't have allies and partners on the same page, and it's likely something that that Pyongyang will look to exploit. So effective engagement will build on security and keep the alliance together. A second question is, do economic sanctions on North Korea's nuclear and missile programs inhibit projects for inter-Korean shared prosperity? And here, given what Seoul is facing under the pandemic, before that, the US-China trade war, what Seoul is facing in terms of strained relations, also including economics with Japan, there was a great amount of hope here that South Korea could seek an end-of-war declaration and pursue a peace economy with North Korea, including infrastructure links, tourism, a peace zone along the demilitarized zone, and pursuing a joint Olympics bid. The problem is that international sanctions frustrate economic engagement, and in particular, a lack of sanctions relief after the Trump-Kim Hanoi summit led South Korea to be unable to entice North Korea back to talks, because it couldn't offer a sizable enough carrot, like restarting the Kaesong Industrial Complex or reopening the Mount Kumgang tourism project. And anyway, the Kim regime often rejects efforts at engagement. It seems to prioritize lucrative payouts over humanitarian aid and symbolic exchanges. And the Kim regime also appears to be very concerned about national pride and regime legitimacy. So tentatively, I would share conclusions that to be sustainable politically and economically, engagement requires reciprocity. Opportunities for post-COVID engagement include some really important initiatives like a joint public health complex in Kaesong, capacity building over trade and border security, and digital infrastructure to support separated family reunions while family members are still alive and looking to meet each other, at least virtually. An inter-Korean bartering trade system could get around the bulk transfer of cash sanctions, but Seoul's legal liabilities and Pyongyang's commitments to upholding contracts remain obstacles. Without consistent engagement, we have what I call a poison carrot problem. The North Koreans are too worried that engagement efforts may be a Trojan horse or may be designed to weaken their system of government. There's also credibility problems without clear punishments or consequences or sticks. As we've seen North Korea hurl insults at the South, make some pretty provocative military threats, like threatening to redeploy troops to demilitarized regions, or threatening to act against South Korean search and rescue operations in the West Sea. And of course, we saw the case of North Korea blowing up the Inter-Korean liaison office. A third set of questions, and I realize my time is tight, so allow me to get through this relatively quickly, about whether concerns over Pyongyang's human rights abuses complicate inter-Korean efforts at reconciliation. Obviously, South Korea continues to struggle with identity contestation over questions of history in North Korea, as people in this room and online, I think, no doubt understand. There's a progressive legislative majority that is shifting legal powers away from conservative institutions like the NIS and the prosecutor's office, and also seeks to enshrine inter-Korean agreements like the Panmunjom Declaration into domestic law. But meanwhile, conservative opposition members argue that international actors won't support large-scale engagement projects without accountability for North Korea's human rights, and they go further in alleging that the current government fails to carry out any sort of accountability vis-a-vis Pyongyang's violations of inter-Korean agreements, while suppressing religious and defector groups critical of the Kim regime here in South Korea. And this polarization is really an issue because it makes a public consensus on a sustainable North Korea policy elusive. So I would argue that we can't ignore human rights for the sake of maintaining momentum and dialogue with Pyongyang. Of course, engaging North Korea promises enormous benefits, reducing the odds of miscalculation and miscommunication, incentivizing political economic reform, and improving the lives and livelihoods of the North Korean people. But the challenge is realizing concrete progress by Pyongyang that they don't backtrack on or they don't try to sell the same horse twice or thrice. And that means minimizing free carrots to the North Korean regime. It requires effective diplomacy that mixes engagement and pressure and inter-Korean reconciliation that is built on human rights improvements and not just symbolic events. So when we look ahead to the post-US election environment, I would like to offer the advice that the United States and South Korea ought to provide measures and pursue a stronger alliance, but also greater engagement of North Korea post-COVID-19. There are theoretical implications for what we've been talking about today. Serious carrot and stick trade-offs, but strategies of incentives and disincentives are not mutually exclusive. It's difficult to right-size the sticks, but you have to have the sticks for deterrence, and you have to address the poison carrot problem so that North Korea will actually be able and willing to accept the engagement initiatives on offer. For engagement and the alliance to be effective, engagement needs to be principled and accountable, but I think that Washington should, by default, support more of Seoul's initiatives, and I hope we have time to talk about those in the question and answer period. Finally, I would conclude by saying that it's important to secure policy cooperation from the region and beyond. This includes coordination with Japan. It includes lining up different China strategies in the region, as China is a very important actor in dealing with North Korea, and just now there's a tremendous amount of friction among many countries' bilateral relationships with Beijing. And it also includes institutional reform at the regional levels, so that you can have capacity building support from international organizations, including international financial institutions, including regional financial institutions, and bringing in the efforts of non-governmental organizations that are an important dimension of engaging North Korea. I thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing these thoughts and look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Leif. I think his presentation, includes both the first, the presentation and second presentation issues because he talks about both the engagement, cooperation, and sanctions. Too. Lastly, but not leastly, we have the Zoom participant from the Berlin, and fourth presentations by Dr. Teresa Novotná, and the title is North Korea and the World Redefining the Role for Europe. It's kind of the Europe's the attitude, the policy toward North Korea, I think. Please.
So hello everybody, greetings from Germany, from Berlin. I'm very happy that I can participate in this IFAS conference, at least via virtual means. As you probably know, 3rd of October is anniversary here in Germany to celebrate, well, this year, 30 years since the unification of Germany. But it's also, for me, a little bit of an anniversary because I realized that exactly 5 years ago, to celebrate the 25th anniversary, I met for the first time colleagues from IFAS in Brussels for a conference. And so it's really great to be sort of back in the virtual world 5 years after that. My talk will focus on role for Europe in redefining role for Europe for North Korea. It is a part of my research project, which is funded by the European Commission within the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship. And my research project is focused on EU foreign policy in North Korea. My talk is also focused or is based on different publications that I've produced in the last several months. You see one, and I will have to be moving my screen a little bit. You see one on the very left about several myths which the Europeans think about North Korea. Then also some steps they should do, that's the one on the right, and then in the middle it's my latest publication about how South Korea and Europe can work together on North Korea and other issues. Of course, I'll be very happy if you will have a look at some of these publications. And the last publication brings me to the next slide, which is a picture from the last EU-South Korea summit that took place at the end of June this year. And although Europeans were mainly focused discussing issues such as the pandemics, such as economic recovery from the health crisis, climate change and others, it was clearly President Moon which brought up the issue of North Korea, and leaders such as Charles Michel acknowledged that, which in my view is a big change to how things were a few years ago. And why is this change? Well, I think it's the result of the different geopolitical situation in which both Europe and South Korea find themselves. In South Korea, there's obviously this saying about shrimp being stuck between the two whales. But Europe, to some extent, is more and more in the same situation. And that's mainly because of the US-China competition. And the Europeans are more and more being squeezed between the two and more asked to choose sides, which the Europeans want to avoid. And because of this a bit difficult challenge of being caught between the two powers, EU and South Korea are trying to work together more than they used to do. This change is, of course, due to the current COVID crisis, but it's also a result of longer-term underlying trends. So, in my view, what the EU and South Korea should do is to, first of all, deepen their strategic partnership, which actually celebrates 10 years also this October. So that's another anniversary, and you can see this nice logo which EU delegation and previous EU ambassador Michael Reiter had done. So the strategic partnership should be deepened in all sorts of areas, but it's not enough. The two partners should also try to look for others who are in similar situation, especially in Asia, and to sort of create a network of like-minded countries. Sorry to move. And that will go well with President Moon's idea of new Southern policy, but also with the EU's effort to create sort of a network of free trade deals around Asia, Northeast, Southeast, South. But, and this is where I'm coming to the issue of North Korea and dealing with North Korea, both the EU and South Korea should look for areas where they can prevent the US-China competition from escalating and from becoming an issue where the two will have to choose which side they will go to. And that area is, in my view, quite clearly North Korea, and therefore both EU and South Korea should come up with joint proposals how to deal with this issue, and therefore how to prevent potential conflict between the two powers over this issue. But before this will be possible, especially from the European side, the Europeans have to sort of rethink a few of the myths which they hold about North Korea. The myths are mainly three myths. The first one is that the PRK or even Korean Peninsula in general is too far away, that the Europeans should deal with other issues closer to home. The second myth is that the PRK is the last area where the EU is on the same page with President Trump. And the last issue, the last myth is that the North Koreans would like to negotiate with the Americans directly anyway. And sort of the flip side of the same coin is that South Korean administration would want to have the EU to meddle in either. I will go through these three myths, say a few things about them, and then come back to the issue: what could the EU actually do? So first, the first myth that the PRK or Korean Peninsula is too far away anyway. Well, it's true that we just had an EU summit these days, and the European leaders were focused on issues dealing with Turkey and migration, and of course also in Belarus and the sanctions against Lukashenko. But it doesn't mean if you look at the issues sort of in your neighborhood, that the big questions, the big developments won't be decided somewhere else, and that's in Asia. When I used to talk about maximum pressure and why the Europeans should look at North Korea from sort of this conflict perspective, I used to say always, well, first of all, no matter what, Europe has already been in the range of North Korean ballistic missiles for a long time, no matter whether they would be actually aimed at Europe or not. But, you know, Europe is covered. And the second issue is the alliance with the United States, also through NATO, because most of the European states are members of NATO, and therefore they can get sucked into potential conflict one way or the other. And we know how conflicts where the US is involved could be divisive for Europeans. Let's just think back about Iraq War. But I think what's nowadays much more important is exactly what I mentioned at the beginning, and that's the issue how to deal with North Korea in the context of the US-China rivalry. And this is going to be an issue no matter what president or no matter what administration will be in place in the United States, whether we will have another Trump-Pence administration or whether we will have Biden-Harris administration. And the reason for that is that there is more or less bipartisan consensus on China within the United States. So to look at North Korea is also to look at and to prevent the US-China competition from deteriorating and being sucked into that. And therefore, from my perspective, although DPRK might be geographically distant from Europe, if Europe neglects it, the geopolitical implications are not that far away. The second myth is looking at the EU-US relations and whether actually DPRK is the last issue where Europeans see an eye to eye with President Trump. And I think there is also a mistake that Europeans do, and I call this mistake Donald Trump syndrome, because the Europeans like to sort of try to circumvent anything what President Trump is doing, because in most of the cases the Europeans disagree with him, be it climate change, be it non-proliferation, be it NATO, and so on. So in a way, Europeans always try to work with other parts of the US administration and sort of avoid whatever President Trump wants to do. And that's, in my view, a mistake, because no matter whether this was done by design or coincidence, and no matter what we think about actually delivery of the summits, mainly in Singapore, but others as well, the general first gut feeling of President Trump to reconfigure the US DPRK relationship from ground up was actually a correct one. And so, in a way, the Europeans shouldn't be worried that they are talking to dictators, because that's not an inherently bad thing, but you need to know what you want and how you want to achieve it. And in a way, the Europeans have been doing it for a long time, but most recently, quite clearly, with strong men like President Erdogan in Turkey, with the Iranian leaders and so on. So they do have good experience with that, but they just somehow don't see it in the case of North Korea and President Trump. And the last issue is whether the North Koreans would like to talk to the Europeans at all. And as an example, I put up here this statement by Vice Minister for European Affairs of the DPRK, which came out in June in KCNA, which was in very careful language criticizing the EU's position, the EU's statement on the blowing up of the liaison office. And although the statement is using very, colorful language, it actually shows that the North Koreans were expecting the EU to do something, to take stand, to be less of a puppet of Washington, so to speak, and to be objective in dealing with the DPRK. So no matter the criticism, in a way shows that North Korea is expecting some action from the Europeans too. And in a way, it's a bit of a shame that so far I haven't seen much of an activity from the German EU presidency, which is running European affairs until the end of this year and this semester. And another evidence of the North Korean interest is all these pictures on the side, which show different visits and different meetings, but mainly visits of European politicians to Pyongyang, where quite clearly the DPRK leadership is always very happy to receive Europeans. So in a way, if the negotiations would move from Washington to Brussels, there's no reason why the North Koreans wouldn't be willing to come to that negotiating table. And the flip side of that coin is whether South Korean administration would be happy to get the Europeans involved. Well, as I was showing at the very beginning from the EU-South Korea summit in June, it was President Moon who brought up the issue of North Korea and who encouraged the Europeans to play an active role. So quite clearly, South Korea would be very happy with European involvement at the highest levels as well. So just quickly, what the Europeans could do. Well, first of all, they should look at their own strategy of what is called critical engagement and revamp it. Because although the name sounds good, in reality it has been much more critical and engaging, and therefore there is quite a good window to create a new strategy, especially since the Europeans have been drafting new strategies for China, for Southeast Asia, for Central Asia, for connectivity and so on. So why not to create a new strategy for Korean Peninsula? But the Europeans shouldn't look just at themselves, they should also look at the Korean Peninsula and propose what I call a broader peace plan, so that these certain steps could be taken to help settle the issues on the Korean Peninsula. And for that, Europeans should multilateralize the issue, and also to create various confidence-building measures, especially in cooperation with like-minded partners, because Europeans have always been actually quite good at doing multilateral negotiations and doing sort of step-by-step negotiations. And that's what I will show you on my last slide, where I have listed various these measures that could be taken by the Europeans to create more trust on the Korean Peninsula between North and South, but also between the Europeans and possibly the Americans and the North Koreans. And I don't have time now to go to all the details, but I would be very happy to discuss these. And my last point is that the EU has just nominated a new EU ambassador to South Korea, who is a lady, Maria Castillo. So I hope that also EU brings a little bit of a feminine touch to this hard power issues on the Korean Peninsula. So thank you very much, and I look forward to a live discussion. Thank you. So hello everybody, greetings from Germany.
Thank you, Tereja. Now this is time for Q&A and discussion, and I'm gonna organize this Q&A session into two rounds. First round is my question specific to your presentation, and the second round is about the answering the common question raised by me. First question is to Professor Kim Tae-kyung and Kugabu, and my question is that you've focused on the quarantine state, and I think it's also great, the concept in explaining North Korea's response to the COVID-19, because they say that they haven't been any confirmed case yet, and that they are corona-free nation. So I also believe that North Korea has conducted a very relatively successful response to the COVID-19, because if the COVID-19 spread the nationwide in North Korea would not be like it is now. So quarantine state is a very important concept, but it seems to me that the North Korea is also using the quarantine state, the concept, as a kind of the dictatorship control toolbox by the adopting the anti-globalization strategy and also the mass public the mobilization. Specifically, North Korea emphasized the importance of responding to the corruption issue and also the bureaucratic malfunction. So I suspect that there's some the relations between the quarantine state and maybe the North Korea's domestic governance the system. What do you think of that, the relations, and then in terms of the presentation? No more than 4 minutes, please.
한국말로 하겠습니다.
I will answer in Korean. The term quarantine state is not a term and concept only applied to DPRK. With the spread of COVID-19, the biggest change on the international scale is that the state government's importance has returned. What I mean is, the biggest impact of COVID-19 is that in the 1970s, late 1970s and early 1980s, we saw the rise of neoliberalism, that the market dominates all. And COVID-19 brought an end to this, because all countries around the world have changed to a quarantine state. The biggest priority is now being put on quarantine and protecting its citizens from the virus. And so this quarantine state concept is not a concept that is limited just to DPRK. And the table that I show you was that scholar Yubari talked about COVID-19 in Economist and said that there are two options that can be selected by states. One axis is totalitarian quarantine, and the other axis is citizen empowerment, citizen participation. And on another axis, there is nationalist isolation and global solidarity. And we made reference of that to create this 2x2 matrix. And if you look at each of the cells, North Korea is selecting nationalist isolation and totalitarian surveillance. And the United States, they are pursuing civic empowerment and national isolation. And we are stressing many things in the K quarantine. And the K quarantine European model, the two shows civic empowerment and global solidarity. So that is a type of quarantine state of Korea, South Korea, and Europe. And this quarantine state concept is not just limited to DPRK. Out of the types of quarantine states, DPRK is pursuing a totalitarian type of quarantine. So that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, I also agree with that, the opinion that the quarantine state, varies in the many states. My question to Dr. Jun Park is about how the North Korea avoid sanctions and adapt to sanctions also. And then it would be great if you can elaborate on, the North Korea's money laundering through, the recently uncovered banking routes and through cyber currency. And my second question is about the U.S. Treasury, movement to curb cyber currency accepted by North Korea. And then I can maybe add some question from the floor later about maybe the similar issues. Could you?
So on elaborating the money laundering scheme, maybe I can't use this, right? Okay. So on elaborating money laundering routes and the systematic ways of how it's actually orchestrated, let me just say that money laundering can occur in different types of forms. We just discussed ransomware and the advisory given out by the US Treasury. Usually how it works is your system usually gets targeted by a certain entity, be it Panda, Fancy Bear, Panda, Cholima, Kitten, Spider. Then your authorities receive an email regarding the ransom that is required by the attackers. Whether you respond to it by paying with bitcoins or other cryptocurrencies or digital currencies, that is up to you. But in the case of South Korea, I believe there hasn't been this kind of ransom give and take. The financial authorities have defended pretty well against these attacks. When your system is compromised, and you offer to respond to the request, then of course there would be this interaction between the attacker and the defender. The bank accounts, money laundering scheme through bank accounts occur in a very different kind of manner as participants of United Nations sanctions and US Treasury sanctions and users of SWIFT bank accounts throughout the world, especially in the free world. All banks are obliged to adhere to the guidelines that counter the sanctions guidelines that are given out either by the UN or by the US. So, for example, if you open a bank account in Japan, they will let you go through several types of paperwork in order to confirm that you will not be transmitting money to an offender, a terrorist, attacker, blah, blah, blah. The same would happen here. The problem is, though, when you're moving massive amounts in scale and when you're moving it through the US banks, due diligence has not been done by the US bank authorities in some parts. I'm not saying all of them, but some parts. And those loopholes augment the amounts of North Korean money laundering schemes in the United States. Usually, as indicated in the FinCEN files, if you regard at this activity beyond North Korea, illicit activities, not just by North Korea, but other countries of the world have perused Deutsche Bank, Barclays, even the United Arab Emirates, the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. So you don't know where this is going to come from, but you have to be prepared. That is the main point of the presentation.
Okay, my question to the lab is about the engagement and sanction. You talked both, about the engagement and sanction, and I'm wondering how you can give us some, example of how to, address incentives and disincentives for North Korea, because we are combining. We need to combine the both carrot and sticks. If you have any, good idea, just let us know that you can. And I can deliver your idea to the Cheongwade, and you can deliver it to the White House.
Thank you, Professor Huang. That's an extremely important question, actually, at the intersection of theory and practice. So since I have just a couple moments to respond, let me reply in terms of a Goldilocks problem, right? In terms of sticks, I think there were some measures we've seen in recent history that may be too much. Fire and fury to the point where we're talking about nuclear buttons on each other's desks. That may be too much. Missile tests to the exact distance where Kim Jong-un is located from the point of origin that the missile was tested in South Korea. These sort of signals of decapitation capability toward North Korea tend to really upset Pyongyang and may put us more down a path of escalation rather than of deterrence. On the other hand, the scaled down exercise schedule that we have now and responding to North Korean provocations or North Korean shooting of a South Korean fisheries official by warning North Korea that it will be held responsible and that behavior is not appropriate, that doesn't seem to be enough of a stick. And so if you ask me what's in the range of just right in that sort of Goldilocks problem, I would say restoring US ROC military exercises to their previous level and frequency for the purposes of deterrence, interoperability, and actually expanding them in terms of multilateralizing deterrence. So including Japan and other partners on certain contingency plans, on humanitarian and disaster relief exercises, and expanding anti-ballistic missile intelligence sharing, I think would be all very helpful. On the carrot side, the not too much problem, or the making the carrots too large, I think, would have been like removing multiple UNSCR resolutions for very little on North Korea's part, like just shutting down Yongbyon, for example. I think that if you're going to talk about rolling back UN Security Council resolution sanctions, there needs to be significant progress along a denuclearization roadmap. On the other hand, sanctions that aren't large enough probably include, as important as they are, humanitarian assistance offers to North Korea. Those carrots don't look large enough to Pyongyang, in part because they have assistance from China already, probably. Individual tourism recommendations, those carrots don't look large enough. So in that zone of just right, I think we might see exemptions for inter-Korean projects, including infrastructure that can support longer-term exchanges, because that looks credible. That looks like a long-term investment. And also in that range of making carrots credible, I think it's important for the United States and South Korea and other key partners in international organizations to be on the same page. Because if they're not on the same page, the carrots don't look like they're going to be sustained from North Korea's perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leif. We can deliver your idea to both the White House and Chongqing now and then. Okay, my last question for the first round to the Teresa is the June participant, Teresa. My question is about do you have any kind of the concrete proposals that the EU can do for North Korea? And also, my second question is about how the former, the Soviet bloc countries, Eastern European countries, and also maybe the Germany, can do, the improve the relations with North Korea, and also to some contribute to resolving the current situation on the Korean situation. You already, talked about the Borrell peace plan, something like that, and then I think it's really good idea. Please.
Yes, hello. I'm not sure whether you can hear and see me. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Maybe I'll try to answer the sort of the question of the concrete proposals. I'll see if I can get to share my screen. Where I've listed some of the concrete proposals. For instance, in one of the first presentations about the quarantine state, we heard that quite a few foreign diplomats left Pyongyang because of the current situation. And that goes actually sort of nicely back to one of the concrete suggestions that I have for the EU, and that's to establish an EU delegation in Pyongyang. As much as there is an EU delegation in Seoul, it makes sense that there would be one in Pyongyang. So to some extent, once the diplomats will be allowed to go back, it will be good opportunity for the Europeans, instead of just to send back all the individual diplomats to individual national missions. It would be good to also send EU representation, at least EU liaison officers, back to North Korea. And it shouldn't be seen as a sort of reward for bad behavior, but it should be as a way how to coordinate better, how to make the European voice heard a bit more on Korean Peninsula issues. It's also, your question about what the Eastern European states, the former Soviet bloc countries, can do or how they can contribute. It's interesting that actually at the moment, those remaining diplomats who are still present in Pyongyang are actually those from countries like my home country, which is Czech Republic, but also Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. So in a way, it's the Eastern Europe who is currently representing the whole of the EU on the ground. And so the experience of the former Soviet bloc countries shouldn't be neglected. maybe on your point about Germany, I'll come back to normal views. Germany at the moment holds EU rotating presidency, which means that basically Germany is in charge of lots of EU affairs for 6 months. And Germany has been putting a lot of effort into trying to finding a unified position on China, so on the EU-China relationship, both in terms of economics and trade, but also in terms of politics, human rights, and so on. At the beginning, I mentioned that Germany celebrated 30 years of the unification. So because of this experience, I find a bit of a shame that the German focus on Asia is just on China, and that Korean Peninsula doesn't seem to play much role in this foreign policy thinking. So there are still a few months left until the end of the year. So if there are any German policymakers listening, I would definitely encourage them to take a bit more active role on this file. And I'll probably stop here. I'm happy to answer another question a bit later.
Okay, thank you. Actually, we have several questions from the floor, but the time is running out. So I'm gonna try to combine all those questions from floor with my own question to all the panelists. And the question is the issue that we haven't touched yet is that the worsening U.S.-China relations, the impact of U.S.-China relations on the Korean Peninsula. So, could you explain more about the impact of the U.S.-China relations, the worsening relations of the U.S. And China on the current situation on the Korean Peninsula, and also the COVID-19, and also the engagement and the sanction issues? Let's start with the Professor Gugabu, and then and you can add whatever you want on today's issue.
미중 관계가 한반도
Rather than worsening U.S.-China relations and its impact on the Korean Peninsula, I would like to make some comments regarding the presentations given. First, we have been stressing sanctions, but the purpose of sanctions is not in sanctions itself. Sanctions should be a means to encourage dialogue and communication with the country. But I feel that we are forgetting the fundamentals of sanctions and the purpose of it. And second, we talked about DPRK cyber attack, but we should also think about U.S.'s cyber attack against DPRK. For example, New York Times mentioned the cyber attack against DPRK to create a disturbance to North Korea's missile systems, and so we should be more balanced. And second, there was comments on a need for a strong U.S.-Korea alliance, but this will lead to more of a security dilemma because it might lead to stronger nuclear capabilities. And in that case, Korean Peninsula peace process will become impossible. Since the end of 2017, we've been talking about the Korean Peninsula peace process, and in exchange for denuclearization, Korea and the U.S. Would stop its military exercises. And since the Hanoi no deal situation, Washington and Pyongyang's relations were deadlocked because of the 2019 April and August joint exercises, and that those joint exercises dealt a negative impact on the peace process. And briefly, just one more point. Third, on the role of European Union, we saw the biggest role of European Union in 2011 when the Troika of EU visited North Korea, and Sweden was the chair country. And since Germany is the chair country, I think that Germany can play a similar role of EU in 2012, similar to 2011.
Let's invite Dr. Park, and you can answer my question also to the
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the comments, Dr. Gu. Before I answer the question on the U.S.-China relations and the impact on South Korea or other parts of the world, let me just say a couple of things about the comments Dr. Koo made on sanctions. So I wholeheartedly agree that the end goal of sanctions is to bring out and induce dialogue with the entity that is being sanctioned. By theory, yes. The reality that we face now is that, okay, the reality is that we have what is so-called war by other means that is ongoing at a very, very rapid pace at the moment. The dialogue that we are seeking to hold may not even occur as we wish it to be if these actions are not deterred. So that's why these efforts have to come together in terms of cyber defense. And with regard to the Obama administration's tactics, what the Obama administration has done is self-defense. And in that regard, it's a sovereign nation's decision. There's no pondering upon it. And I think the South Koreans would do the same if the same situation occurred. Very briefly on the US-China relations and Korea, I think the biggest impact is probably economic with regard to the Huawei ban and Samsung Semiconductors, SK Hynix Semiconductors not being able to sell their chips, advanced chips, because of the Huawei ban, and getting in line with the US demands, but at the same time always trying to get back to business with China, because both companies have filed an exemption request to the US Commerce. South Korea will continue to walk this line for as long as it takes, in my opinion, and it will continue to be dancing between those two countries. And sometimes that will bring a lot of risk, security risk, but it's something that we can't avoid under this administration.
Okay, thanks. Blake, please.
Thank you. The deterioration in U.S.-China relations is very problematic for the fidelity of Beijing's sanctions enforcement. And I think that concern is often expressed by analysts and officials, and I would share that concern. But I would like to emphasize that the deterioration in U.S.-China relations is also problematic for coordinating engagement. And this is because the significant enough carrots that will interest North Korea for cooperation will not be credible unless nested in regional and international cooperation. And so that requires coordination with China in a big way. And current relations between Washington and Beijing get in the way of that, unfortunately. It's also important that as much as we look into North Korea from the outside and see the needs of the North Korean people, in light of recent natural disasters, in light of mismanaged economic policies, in light of aid organizations that are having difficulty reaching North Koreans because of sanctions, but especially because of North Korean political interference. While we may see those needs, the North Korean regime doesn't prioritize its people to the extent that makes sense to many other governments and certainly NGOs around the world. And as long as US-China relations are so strained and there's lack of coordination with Beijing on engagement, that means that North Korea has something of a luxury of rejecting overtures from Seoul because it relies so heavily on Beijing, and the carrots and sticks toward Pyongyang are not coordinated among North Korea's neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you. We are a little behind our schedule, but we still need to invite our June participant from Germany. And then could you please answer just please 1 minute, Teresa?
Yes, am I now on? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay, good, thank you. Yes, so I can just agree to all the previous, agree with all the previous speakers, you know, the impact of the tensions on the sanctions, on engagement and so on. But I think probably the biggest impact will be on just geopolitical arrangement of countries. This is important for Europeans as well, because Europeans do not want to be sucked into the competition between China and the US. And if North Korea becomes an issue, becomes another place of tensions, then obviously Europeans will also be pretty much forced to take one side or the other, or to come up with some ideas that would prevent this from happening. And this is what I was trying to argue in my presentation. And this is also where the Europeans should work with South Korea as much as possible, so that it doesn't happen. So I would just conclude with saying this, that because of the China-US competition, the cooperation between Europe and South Korea is probably needed more than it was before. And North Korea is one of those topics where the cooperation should be strengthened. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think today we have very the valuable and the very wonderful ideas to the resolving, the contributing to the resolving the many issues on the Korean Peninsula. I hope that we have another the opportunity to discuss more on these issues. And have an announcement for the next session. The next session will start 3:50 p.m. So I think that we have about 10 minutes break for your refreshment. Thank you. This is for the first session. Thanks a lot. Let's give our panelists to the big hands.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Next, on my right, let me introduce Dr. Gang Ha-yun. She is the Executive Director of the Division of International Cooperation Research at the Korean Information Society Development Institute. Wow, that's a real mouthful. But Dr. Gong boasts a wealth of government-related experience working in international trade, negotiations, and providing expertise to international organizations. And for the past couple of years, she's been focused a lot on ICT policy development of developing countries. So Dr. Gong, welcome. On my left, our third panelist, Dr. Christopher McCarthy. He is a visiting research fellow here at the Institute for Far Eastern Studies. He's an environmental expert who has spent a number of years working in the field in remote areas on various environmental and biodiversity related projects here in Asia. But at least for the coming year, I think he finds himself behind a desk conducting research that involves kind of investigating different pathways on how North Korea can achieve international targets concerning biodiversity and environmental conservation. So we're glad to have him here, Christopher.
Thank you, Professor Watt.
Okay. And our fourth participant is Mr. James Banfill. He is also one of this year's IFAS Visiting Research Fellows. He has previously worked in North Korea and traveled throughout the country in various capacities, including tourism, I think cultural projects, scientific exchange, I think aid monitoring and agricultural aid monitoring. So James, we're glad to have you here.
Thank you, Dr. Allett.
Okay, now in the interest of time, I'm going to jump right into our presentations. And for our first presentation, we have Dr. Nazanin Zadeh-Cummings. She has prepared a video for us. So we're going to look at resetting humanitarian engagement with North Korea and lessons from history. So we will go to that presentation right now.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Nazanin Zadeh-Cummings, and I'm the Associate Director of Research and Lecturer in Humanitarian Studies at the Center for Humanitarian Leadership, which is based at Deakin University here in Melbourne. I'm really excited to be joining you all today virtually and would like to thank the organizers, both IFAS and FNF, for inviting me, and also thank my fellow panelists and anyone who's tuning in. So today I'm going to give a short talk called Resetting Humanitarian Engagement with North Korea, Lessons from History. So I thought I would kick off with this press release from 1996. It's about 24 years old, and it's from the UN Department of Humanitarian Affairs, which is defunct, and we now have the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, but this was during the UN DHA days, and the release reads, the United Nations seeks $43.6 million for humanitarian assistance to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So this was at the very early stages of engagement between international humanitarian actors and the DPRK. This is when North Korea was in the midst of famine, so really in the throes of a humanitarian crisis. And as you can see towards the end of the small snippet I have on the screen here, the UN is citing severe and unprecedented floods as the cause for the humanitarian need in North Korea at the time. So moving forward now to February 2020 this year, this is a release for the Provisional 2020 DPRK Needs and Priorities Overview, and this is a document that's released annually by the Humanitarian Country Team, which is made up of both UN agencies and humanitarian non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. And you can see that in 2020, this was pre-COVID ask, the HCT were requesting about $107 million for humanitarian programming in North Korea. So we are 25 years from the initial engagement beginning in 1995, but we're still seeing humanitarian presence, even though we're not in a situation of famine as we were in the 1990s, but instead really in a context of protracted systemic humanitarian need that has required long-term humanitarian assistance. So here I have 5 what I call enduring and new challenges to aid in 2020, because of course we have COVID-19 presenting new challenges to the way the world works, but we also have some challenges that have been present in North Korea since day one, and others that have emerged in more recent years but still continue. So, for example, we have the issue of multilateral and unilateral sanctions, which claim to have humanitarian exemptions, but in practice are still negatively impact humanitarian aid's ability to reach North Koreans and its ability to be agile and timely. We, of course, have the constraints from the regime. So these are access constraints on humanitarian agencies' ability to interact with people, gather data, gather information, and go places. And we also have funding shortfalls. So we have donors that are not particularly willing to fund North Korea programs for the 25th year in a row, which then also can impact access, which I'll get to in a little bit. And finally, the final challenge that I have on here in the purple box is the idea of geographic hazards, which we saw cited in that 1996 press release, and that these continue to this day. You'll note that I don't use the term natural disasters, and that's because I belong to the school of thought that no disasters are natural. Disasters happen when geographic hazards, things like floods, earthquakes, typhoons, when they interact with human decision-making is when they become disasters. So I really push back on the term natural disasters and instead refer to them as geographic hazards. So with the past couple minutes is a very, very, very brief gloss over of some of the things we've seen in the past 25 years. That's kind of to set the stage for this question of, as we look to the future of humanitarian aid in North Korea, what can we learn from the past quarter century of engagement? And my reflections on that question reveal 3 initial lessons. So the first is that relationships are extremely important and that they take time. The second is that humanitarian aid is unable to provide solutions to political problems. And the third is that access is dynamic and requires more than just North Korean approval to expand. So I'm going to go now through each of these lessons briefly. So globally, humanitarians have come up with standards and frameworks to inform best practice and shape international humanitarian response. But amongst all of that, I think what can sometimes get lost is really the importance and value of interpersonal relationships. It's something that's really challenging to quantify and measure. And of course, the North Korean context presents some really obvious challenges to building and maintaining relationships. But despite these challenges, what we've seen over the past 25 years is that humanitarians are able to do this. They are able to build relationships, build constructive partnerships, and really find spaces to create trust. So from my PhD, which was about humanitarian NGOs and their engagement in North Korea between 1995 and 2016, I identified 5 levels of interaction between humanitarians and North Koreans. And these 5 levels include the primary interlocutor and local staff, so local staff referring to North Koreans who work with resident NGOs. The second is line ministries, so for example, the Ministry of Public Health. The third is provincial level organs. The fourth is individual institutions, so this is something like a university or a hospital. And then finally, the fifth was aid recipients. So these 5 levels aren't exclusive, or they're not a pattern that, you need to go through one to get to the next. It's more just a way of conceptualizing the different ways that humanitarians can interact and form relationships with North Koreans. And I've included here 3 quotes from publications authored by individuals with years of humanitarian experience in North Korea that attest to the importance of relationships. So we have first Eric Weingartner, who's with the Food Aid Liaison Unit, who wrote, "Experience has shown time and time again that Koreans operate very firmly on the principle of relationships." Next, we have from a paper by Edward Reed, who's with World Vision, said that personal relationships, Mercy Corps, I believe, said that personal relationships are one component that influence whether aid agencies are able to stay in North Korea. And then finally, I have a quote from Kathy Zellweger, who says, for a foreigner to obtain realistic information and develop an accurate understanding of the country and its people, long-term engagement, patience, and the development of mutual trust are necessary. And I think this idea of trust is really important. And trust is something that we've seen really takes time and is a process. So in the face of COVID-19 and in the face of even pre-existing ability to travel to North Korea really being curtailed, eventually whenever it may be that humanitarians are able to travel to North Korea again, I think it's normal to expect that there will be some setbacks because relationships have not been able to be maintained in the way they have before. And so I guess my message, again, wouldn't necessarily be to humanitarians because I think they would be the first to tell you some of these things, but also especially to donors. You can't necessarily expect to pick up where you left off, that this process of building relationships and trust will take time to restart. So my first lesson from history is that relationships matter, and that we need to keep that in mind as post-COVID or COVID normal aid picks up again whenever that may be. So the second lesson that I want to present today is around this idea of access. So I argue that access is dynamic and requires more than North Korean approval to expand. So access is something we hear a lot about when we talk about North Korea, this idea of access restrictions. And of course, North Korea is a very restricted environment. As I say, access is dynamic. It can be loosened, it can be granted, but it can also be taken away. So understanding it as kind of a linear progression towards more and more access, I think is not representative of what humanitarians have seen over the past 25 years. And the second point is that it really takes, of course, the North Korean approval is central to access, but it's not the only factor that is impacting access. One very important factor impacting access is that of funding. If humanitarians don't have the resources to be able to expand their programming, how can we expect North Korea to expand their ability to access people, places, and information? And so I have here data from the UN Financial Tracking Service from 2015 to 2019, with the kind of pink bar on the bottom representing the unmet funding requirements and the orange bar representing the met funding requirements. So we can see that the humanitarian country team received less than 1/3 of its funding every year from 2015 to 2019. So in such a chronically underfunded situation, of course, this is going to have an impact on access. Lesson 3 is that humanitarian aid cannot provide solutions to political problems. So what do I mean when I say that humanitarian aid cannot provide solutions to political problems. North Koreans do not experience humanitarian need because of floods or because of earthquakes. Need is rooted in political and economic decision-making made by the regime. And humanitarian aid is not a tool to reform the regime or change the regime or bring political solutions. So this lesson really shows, I think it's important to recognize that aid, I think, of course, does do a lot of good, but it's important to remember what aid is capable of and that aid is not capable of addressing the root causes of need because these root causes are political. And I've chosen a quote here from the FAO Global Information Early Warning System Special Alert in May 1996. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll maybe start kind of halfway through where it says, it's clear that in the past, food supply depended heavily on the general state of the economy and its capacity to finance imports. As this is no longer the case, it is evident that the country urgently needs to address these issues and implement some radical solutions if it is to avert serious problems in the future. So here we see a UN publication really explicitly calling out the political and economic root causes of the famine and saying that there really is a need for radical solutions. And I would say we can say the same thing now, 24, 25 years later, that there really needs to be radical solutions that target the political causes of humanitarian need in North Korea. So this is my kind of so what slide. So what if we know that relationships matter? So what if we know that humanitarian aid can't bring political solutions? So I would say the lesson on relationships really emphasizes the need for patience. Once travel is able to resume to North Korea and once aid is able to pick up again, that we, meaning the international community and donors, need to be patient. Secondly, because humanitarian aid cannot bring solutions to political problems, there needs to be multiple approaches within the international community. There also needs to be realistic indicators and expectations for humanitarian aid. Finally, with access, I think this shows really the importance of adequate funding and also for the efficacy of sanctions exemptions. If sanctions exemptions are also curtailing aid, then that can also have a negative impact on ability to gain and maintain access. Finally, these are some of the citations from my presentation, and thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Hello and good afternoon. My name is Nazanin Sajay Cummings, and I'm the...
Okay, thank you very much, Nazanin, for the presentation and everything right there. Some key themes that come out of there: interpersonal relationships, funding difficulties, aid not being a solution for political problems. Something that maybe we can explore a little bit more in the discussion session. We'll move right along, though, to our second presentation. And at this point, I'll ask Dr. Gang to make her presentation on North Korea Online, reconnecting through ICT with North Korea.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Hayeon Kang Hayeon. I come from KISTI. KISTI is a government-sponsored research institution in Korea, actually located in Jincheon, Chungcheongbuk-do, and where I'm probably the only person interested in something related to North Korea. But however, we are a research institution dedicated to ICT policies in general, and we do have expertise in providing ICT policy consultation to developing countries. So the presentation today I give is trying to understand North Korea from a development perspective, and this might be very different from the kind of talks that most audiences
have access to, because when we think about North Korea, it's always the cybersecurity threat issues and their hacking abilities and very scary things. But I'm going to provide a quite different view, in the sense that I'm trying to provide a view of North Korea trying to engage science and technology and trying to put that for socioeconomic development purposes. Maybe whether they've been successful at it or not, something that we can discuss at the end of the presentation. Before I begin, I really want to thank the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom and also the 극동문제연구소 for giving me this opportunity to do the presentation. I just want to do that before I forget. Okay, so can we move on? Do I do this with this? Okay. 이건가요? Oops, sorry. Green button. Okay. 네. Okay, thank you. So the presentation will be in four stages. Now I'm going to provide a very brief history of IT policy in North Korea. People use the term ICT or IT interchangeably these days. I generally use ICT, but I used IT here because IT takes less space in the PPT slide, okay? So that's the only reason I use IT here. So I'll provide a brief history, and then also I want to talk a little bit about why these IT policy have changed over time in the context of the particular political and economic issues that North Korea faced. And I want to focus particularly on one very interesting aspect of the North Korean political economy, which I named the 장마당 economy. It is something that many people who have knowledge of North Korea are already aware of. And I will conclude with some speculations about whether inter-Korean cooperation in the field of ICT can be possible in the future. Okay. So to look at the history of IT policy in North Korea, maybe we can divide this into four stages. At the beginning, there was a very strong emphasis on science and technology as a foundation for building a very strong socialist state. This changes over time with emphasis on IT technology being applied to at the level of industry and factories. And since 2000, I would say, since the 21st century, there's actually greater emphasis on IT education, research and R&D in the frontline technologies, and clearly a focus on IT, connecting that with the increasing or improving the welfare of the people. Of course, IT was important to North Korea in the context of its developing its military capability and all, but this is something that many experts out there already have great knowledge and expertise, which I do not have. So I'm not going to talk about that here. So I'm just going to go briefly over the beginnings. Interestingly enough, Kim Il-sung was actually he was very interested in the role of science and technology in building a socialist state, so that even the first generation computer was made during this period. And they already, even starting in the 70s, had these national economic plans in which mechanization and automation of production using science and technology was emphasized. He commands, actually, the continuation of the economy's self-reliance, modernization through science and technology. The three keywords that many have heard in regards to North Korea, 주체화, 현대화, 과학화. These three keywords are impossible without reference to science and technology. So this continues into the 1980s and up for the next 20 years under the Kim Jong-un regime. And this is in the context of, if you remember, the late 80s, early 90s was actually a great IT tech boom globally. It was not just a North Korean phenomenon. So in that context, North Korean policy elites tried to use that as a backdrop, trying to leapfrog the technological ladder using IT policy. So they actually termed it the Great Leap, I believe. And this is the period where they established the Chosun Computer Center, which is a very well-known entity that has developed the various softwares indigenous to North Korea. Pyongyang Information Center was also established in this period, and North Korea's intranet, Kwangmyeong, was again built in 1995, very early on, and a national network was established in 1998. So these efforts, quite obvious at the beginning, were stalled, however, because, as you know, North Korean economy meets this huge challenge with the demise of the socialist bloc and being cut off from that, economic connection. They experience what everybody knows, the arduous march, the 고난의 행군, and this is a period where the early efforts pretty much stops. However, we do see the seeds of this policy interest in developing science and technology and putting that for development purposes. But we do also have to note that IT technology was important to promote the military capability as well. And another thing that we should be noting here is that the emphasis here again was not in developing hardware like semiconductors and high value-added tech products, but actually in software. Software development costs less money. It's much more labor-intensive compared to other areas, something that many developing countries can easily enter into. So this is again a period where the regime sets up educational programs throughout the country, especially in Kim Il-sung 대학교, Kim Il-sung University. The computer science department was established in 1999. In the Kimchek Engineering University, there was actually a department titled Information Science Technology. And then also under the 국가과학원, which is the National Academy of Science, there's some kind of a program, again, dedicated to developing IT technology. This is also a time where emphasis on computer education begins. And this, I'm sorry. Okay, so this continues even under the successor Kim Jong-un, and this I talked about this emphasis on education. North Korean kids in junior and high school, they get an average of 1,600 hours of computer education. And this is a very highly developed program for gifted students. So this very high emphasis on education begins early on, and we now estimate more than 1,000 such experts being very active economically outside of North Korea. So those they are probably in the field of software, development industries, and so on. Kim Jong-un also is noted for creating new government bodies, again, dedicated to IT policy. So for me, there's a 전자공업성 and 21국. These are two new bodies that they create. And here again, these two bodies engage in frontline technology development. policies. And also, this is a period where they attempt to merge IT technology with national welfare. So while under the Kim Jong-un, where IT technology served the dual purpose, probably with more emphasis on developing military capability, I think it's notable that under Kim Jong-un, IT technology, digital technology and all, are emphasized also strongly for the purposes of the socio-economic welfare of the people. And this is also, we should note, where national mobile services began actively, and where now North Korea has officially 3 mobile service operators. So before I move on, I just want to show you a brief table of North Korea's technology development plan. In Korea, in South Korea, historically, we also had such development plans in the science and technology areas. In fact, the current Korean government, again and again, they come up with these 5-year plans, 10-year plans, and this is something that many developing countries are very much interested. Oh, I don't have a lot of time, so I will skip this. Okay. And now I'm going to talk about the 장마당 economy. Again, 장마당 economy is pretty much linked to the failure of the socialist bloc and the arduous march in North Korea. North Korea experiences a failure of currency reform in 2009, which everybody knows, and this led to the marketization of North Korea. In fact, because the official distribution system fails, local markets begin to rise throughout the countries, and this local market are very close linked with mobile telephony. So this is a picture of 장마당s, and a picture of how they're all spread out in North Korea and all. And how does this 장마당 work? Thanks to the telephone services, mobile telephone services that is now available in North Korea. And this is actually a bit of information maybe because I lack time, maybe I can't go into. Just want to point out that while compared to other countries, mobile subscription rate is not that high, the rate of development has been very much strong in North Korea. So this is again another picture of how the 3 mobile services were introduced in North Korea. And while we know that they don't have 4G services, at least we do know that they have 3G services. And this is again a comparison of North Korean mobile phone subscriptions. And the one on the right is actually comparing with South Korea. Again, very low compared to South Korea, but still strongly rising since 2009. And again, this is again a picture of mobile handsets. North Korea now do have smartphones, unlike, and they are quite actually useful. I mean, they in terms of design and features, they are not that bad. Actually, I had a look at it. The price ranges around 200 to 700, and it's pay-as-you-go payment system. And here I provide a comparison of the 3 recent models in North Korea compared to Korea's Galaxy A7, which is a model that appeared in 2018. So we could say that these smartphones, in terms of capabilities, lack about 2 to 3 years behind South Korea. In terms of the hardware and the software built into it, mostly Chinese or Taiwanese or Russian parts. And I also want to talk about mobile finance, because thanks to this 3G network, they do have beginnings of fintech in North Korea, and there's about 20 such digital cards now in Korea, and where North Koreans actually can purchase things using such cards. And most recently, they have introduced a mobile payment application. So this is like mobile payment system on your smartphones. And I just want to point out how this serves a dual purpose. While it is certainly a tool of economic development, and the 3G services introduced and the rise of the Jangmadang economy, thanks to mobile telephony, have all helped or assisted or supplemented the socialist economy that the regime is trying to maintain. And mobile finance is replacing North Korea's weak financial infrastructure. And it is also, actually, we are seeing the beginnings of a new class of people that are beginning to profit from their commercial activities using mobile telephones. However, clearly, this is a regime that is aware that information being spread under this mobile paradigm can be hurtful in maintaining social control. So that mobile phone users are quite wary of using the phone other than just for communicating. So they don't use the various applications, which are state-sponsored applications installed in the smartphones, because they are worried that their use will be tracked by the regime. Also, we do know that they have a very strong surveillance system implemented in their mobile network, which I can talk later. But I do also want to point out that from a development perspective, because of their strong emphasis on science and technology development and this rapid application of mobile network into their economy, and their strong desire to learn about frontier technologies is a strong thing to consider. And we might want to consider how this could play a positive role in imparting North Korean leadership towards such socioeconomic goals. Other variables to consider, of course, the comments about cybersecurity issues and the UN sanctions and all that. So I think I'll end here because of the lack of time. So sorry about this.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Of course, when we think about North Korea and you talk about IT or ICT, immediately you think of hacking, sanctions evasion, other aspects of that. And I'm glad to see your presentation. It takes more of a development perspective because that doesn't always make the headlines. It doesn't get a lot of screen time. Hopefully in our discussion, maybe I can give you a chance to elaborate a little bit more on some of those aspects you didn't get a chance to. Moving on to our third presentation, I'm going to ask Dr. McCarthy. He's going to talk about national parks, protected areas, and biodiversity conservation in North Korea, opportunities for international collaboration. So Dr. McCarthy, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris McCarthy. I'm a visiting research fellow here at IFAS. Thank you, Professor Willett and the Frederick Naumann Foundation for having me here today for this important discussion on reimagining North Korea. Today I'd like to introduce my research on conservation. Specifically, I will be speaking on national parks, protected areas, and biodiversity conservation. I also hope to highlight why I think biodiversity conservation is an area in which North Korea and the international community can and should act together on as soon as COVID blows over. So I think an important starting point for this discussion is to first understand the seriousness of the global biodiversity crisis, so it's not lost on us why this is an urgent problem for everyone. In the last few months, several important papers have been published about the extent of the problem. Since 1970, the world has seen a devastating decline in biodiversity numbers, largely due to human pressures from things like habitat loss. And this has existential implications for everyone on the planet. So while the international community has tried to act and mobilize efforts to try and prevent further loss of species, most notably with the HE biodiversity targets, very little progress has been made. So the question is what to do now? Well, a silver lining in these reports found that wilderness and protected areas contribute measurably to protecting biodiversity and threatened ecosystems. And it's a relatively easy and cost-efficient thing for countries to accomplish if the will is there. So what do we know of North Korea's current environmental status? North Korea has diverse ecosystems in which forests and wetlands are very important. However, deforestation stemming from a need for things like firewood, energy, and food have resulted in rapid degradation and a significant decline in total forest area. It's important to note that North Korea has a population density even higher of China. So there is an incredible amount of pressure that exists on North Korea's fragile ecosystems. Yet a 2006 survey, this is some of the most recent data we have of North Korea's biodiversity, reported a high density of species among Northeast Asian countries, several of which have high economic value, including high timber value tree species and medicinal plants. So protection of North Korea's biodiversity has real economic value for the country. Korea has some, when I first looked into conservation in North Korea, I was surprised to learn that the country has a long tradition of protected areas dating back to Kim Il-sung. In fact, North Korea has some 34 types of protected areas, ranging from biosphere reserves, national parks, natural monuments, natural reserves, and protected areas. So while this is significant, the total area of protected areas only amounts to roughly 2.4%. In comparison, China, Japan, and South Korea have a far greater amount of land under protected area status. In addition, the connectivity rate, which is important because it allows for species to move and migrate, resulting in healthier populations, distribution, and resilience, is only 4%. So expansion of protected areas and improving the connectivity rate are two key areas that I will touch upon later as an opportunity for international collaboration. North Korea does have environmental laws. However, the efficacy of these laws and the mechanisms for preventing environmental degradation is unknown. Research has shown us that top-down, centralized approaches to protecting biodiversity, which are common in North Korea, usually do not produce optimal conservation outcomes. The country does not have any laws on the conservation of threatened species or on comprehensive biodiversity conservation that we know of. There are encouraging signs, though. Recently, North Korea has voluntarily become party to major international biodiversity agreements, such as the HE biodiversity targets and Sustainable Development Goals, both of which call on member countries to proactively protect their biodiversity, primarily through the expansion of their protected areas network. However, you can notice there's plenty of work still to be done as North Korea needs to figure out how to expand from 2.4% to 17%, the goal set by the HE agreement. North Korea is also participatory to the East Asia-Australasia Flyway, which is a network of intergovernmental agencies, NGOs, in the private sector that have partnered to protect important wetlands and staging sites for migratory birds. North Korea is home to two important staging sites at Mundak and Raesan, which sees tens of thousands of migratory birds each year. These wetlands were classified as Ramsar sites, or wetlands of international importance, in 2018. Again, these are very encouraging signs that suggest North Korea sees value in protecting their biodiversity and is willing to engage with the international community to make progress on important international agreements to protect its biodiversity. Here are just some quick examples of major conservation areas in North Korea, all of which are formally classified by the IUCN, giving them internationally recognized protected area status. Category 2 are for generally protected areas that aim to protect large-scale ecological processes, and Category 4 aims to protect particular species. You can see that some of these parks date back to as early as 1959, like Mount Paektu, Mount Kumgang, and Mount Kuwol, which all have important endemic flora and fauna. So as a conservation specialist, my research explores how different governance structures result in different conservation outcomes among the world's protected areas, mostly in East Asia, Unfortunately, without the ability to conduct field research or without communication channels with our North Korean conservation counterparts, we know very little about the current state of North Korea's protected lands. A survey of national parks in 2013 by an international delegation reported barren landscapes absent of wildlife. However, we really don't have data to support this claim, and this reveals a critical problem in assessing the efficiency of North Korea's protected areas, and that is the lack of information and data. Primary data sets commonly used by researchers to assess the current global conservation situation are lacking, and there are very few scholarly articles that address the issue. One of the tools that I use and that we rely on to give us a general understanding of the environment in North Korea is satellite imagery. Satellite imagery can reveal species distribution, habitat loss, human encroachment, and other important indicators. These images show the protected areas of Mount Kuwal and Mount Chilbo. Highlighted in red is forest degradation, some of which has encroached and in some cases actually entered into the protected area boundaries. Now, this is a challenge given that the goal of these protected areas is to protect biodiversity. So it's really important to think about where the breakdown is and how to enhance protections of North Korea's protected lands and wild areas. Now, my speculation is that the top-down approach, bad planning, low information, lack of resources, and a lack of inclusiveness with the local communities creates opportunities for this exploitation. So as I mentioned, conservation is an area in which I think North Korea and the international community can act together immediately as soon as the COVID situation plays out. And North Korea's commitment to taking actions towards multilateral environmental agreements such as the HE targets and SDGs present an opportunity for collaboration, particularly on capacity development initiatives and scientific exchange. Critical to conservation is timely and accurate data and the ability to monitor and measure natural systems and human impacts. Comprehensive data sets that make it possible to monitor biodiversity change across time and space are crucial for improving our understanding of the socio-ecological systems in North Korea and enhancing policy and environmental decision-making. And there is no shortage of tools that can be utilized with the appropriate training that can help North Korea create these data streams. For example, satellite imagery and GIS, camera trap technology, and bioacoustic recording devices combined with deep learning can be used alongside direct field observations to accurately address these critical data gaps. But of equal importance is making this data transparent and publicly available to the international community for analysis, monitoring, and conservation planning. Creating a channel for scientific dialogue and opportunities for knowledge sharing are critical. So to wrap up my presentation, I would just like to reiterate the urgency of the current biodiversity crisis. Protection of biodiversity is in the interest of all. It's in the interest of North Korea because it ensures long-term protections of important ecological systems. It's important for the international conservation community because it contributes to progress on important international agreements. And it's important for the plants and animals because their habitats and the ecological services they provide will be protected for future generations. I believe continued degradation of North Korea's biodiversity is a situation everyone wants to avoid, and it also undermines the important work being done in the humanitarian space. It's worth pointing out that biodiversity loss impairs the environment's ability to recover from natural and human-induced disasters. It destroys natural systems that purify air and water. It exacerbates risk and incidence of infectious disease. It reduces potential to discover new medicines. It increases flooding, drought, and other environmental disasters, degrades the economy, weakening social and political stability. Ecotourism would be particularly affected. And a loss of wildlife is simply a loss of joy, wonder, and inspiration. Fortunately, we have solutions, and we can bend the curve by working together to increase land under conservation management. Rethinking conservation in North Korea should also take into consideration the needs of local communities, which is proven to be essential for achieving long-term conservation goals. Lastly, I would like to pose the question to the panel and the audience. If we continue with a business-as-usual approach, how can we expect to make progress on global biodiversity goals? What is the alternative to an international collaboration at this time, especially when the stakes are so high? Keep in mind, the earth and the environment is what we all have in common. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCarthy. Very interesting presentation there, and I think environmental conservation, I think with our current situation with the COVID virus, it places front and center the importance of the environment, and as an area of non-traditional security, it is definitely, in my beliefs, one area that we can really look towards in the future for hopefully promoting more types of cooperation or exchanges, interactions with North Korea. Hopefully we can get into some stuff in the discussion session about that. We'll move right on, though, to our fourth panelist. I will ask Mr. James Banfield. He will make a presentation telling us lessons for working in North Korea, sharing situational experiences. So in our building of a foundation for any kind of future exchanges, he's going to give us some advice.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ouellette. Once again, my name is James Banfield, and I am a visiting fellow at IFAS. It is a pleasure to be here today. So today, as we take the time to reevaluate, review, and reconnect with North Korea, I think it's important to talk about what it looks like to practically work inside North Korea. So the purpose of this presentation is really twofold. It's number one, to share 6 practical lessons on working in North Korea based on my own experiences, which I think may be helpful to others who want to become involved in the field. And number 2, to make a call for further sharing of situational knowledge among the greater community of North Korea practitioners, watchers, and analysts. Generally speaking, I see working in North Korea as an exercise in problem solving. This is a complex operational environment. The more experience you have, of course, the better you will be prepared. However, it's also a difficult place to gain experience, especially now. There's a steep learning curve, and in the spirit of the times, I ask, how can we work to flatten that curve? So I want to start this presentation with a quote and a scenario which I think are illustrative of working inside North Korea. The quote is, "The British Army always fights uphill in the rain at the junction of 2 maps." So while totally unrelated to North Korea, it does describe how it often feels to work inside North Korea, namely facing a combination of challenges all at the same time. In some cases, you do in fact find yourself at the junction of 2 maps. Here's an old map of downtown Pyongyang at the junction of 2 maps. Imagine navigating with that. Now imagine a scenario where you're finally in Pyongyang post-COVID, so we've waited a long time. Today, you are scheduled to visit a location, perhaps a hospital, that is 3.5 hours away. And keep in mind that's a drive 3.5 hours each way. Your funders require an on-site evaluation to allocate vital medicines. There is a medical emergency in your party, of course unexpected, and it's potentially life-threatening. You've got 7 people in your party, 3 North Korean counterparts, 2 vehicles, 2 cell phones. Maybe you can make the trip later in the week, maybe not. What do you do? And decide now, or in the next 10 minutes. So I think one takeaway from this is just how many things you need to be thinking about when you're working in North Korea. There's accountability and transparency. There are domestic guidelines. There's the health of your party. There's the skill set of your party. There's transport, cell phone coverage, what might be possible later in the week, what might not be possible. Another point is that you're probably going to have to make hard calls and with uncertain information. You are going to be frustrated. You're going to be angry at times, you're probably going to cry, and you'll probably want to give up. But my message here is today, don't give up. This is some of the most meaningful work you will ever do. And so I think it's important to recognize that working in North Korea is difficult. Those working in the country have fatigue, physical fatigue, mental fatigue, donor fatigue. There is burnout, there is high turnover among staff. There are also knowledge gaps between organizations, institutions, and across generations. As a result, I think we often end up reinventing the proverbial wheel, in this case, a Cholima tractor wheel. In other words, we often repeat the mistakes of those who have gone before us when navigating the North Korean system and working with North Korean partners. This is especially alarming given the importance of constructive relationships with North Korean partners to the success of any project, and this was mentioned in an earlier presentation, which brings us to the first of 6 lessons in this presentation, which you may find familiar. So lesson 1, in my experience and the experience of many others, being effective in North Korea requires having strong relationships with dedicated North Korean partners. Often these relationships take years to develop. When outside organizations have turnover, it's not only a loss to that organization itself, but also a greater loss to their partners inside North Korea. So we often hear North Korea practitioners say, hey, it feels like we're starting over again, and that's how many of us may feel during this COVID crisis. And it's important to remember that our North Korean partners say and feel the same thing. So I want to raise this question: what can we practically do to make sure that we're not relearning the same lessons over and over again? And how can we make sure that our projects, our partners, and ourselves can carry on safely? I think the first step is to have a realistic idea of the working environment, which brings us to lesson 2. A common North Korean saying is that there are many eyes watching. That is, people will be watching you and your partners throughout the course of your work. This is something you need to take seriously, and it will almost affect everything you do. I'm definitely not the first person to mention these eyes, but I think it is important to characterize what kind of eyes are watching so that they don't become something nebulous, they don't become exotic, and they don't become terrifying. These eyes are not the all-knowing eye from Lord of the Rings, nor is working in North Korea a spy movie. And you are not James Bond, unfortunately. There is, however, a system of reporting in North Korea akin to spying about what you do and say, and this is especially the case for your early trips in the country. My sense is this system is mainly looking for discrepancies in your story. It is updated from time to time, even after you become a known entity, even 10 years later. As time goes by, the reporting may become routine. It's just all made up, is how one reporter put it himself. The reporting continues by your North Korean partner, just fills it with mostly harmless fiction. In actuality, most people are probably not spying on you, but they will gossip about you. And gossip, even though it's untrue, can often have real-world consequences, especially in North Korea. So in some respects, gossip is the thing you need to watch out for in the country. Gossip can affect your reputation, and in turn, your ability to get things done. So finally, there's another kind of eye, and that's just the blind eye, in which those North Koreans that are watching you do not act on what they see unless some sort of problem occurs, but it's important to remember they're there. So I think the broad takeaways here are that you need to be aware of the situation at all times, but not let it become a roadblock to your work. In essence, don't panic, but at the same time, do not become too comfortable there either. Above all, you need to be consistent in your story. Lesson 3, memory is important in North Korea, and I think it's important to remember just what you have said and done in order to be consistent, because others will certainly remember what you have said and done. Along these lines, you should think about the wider impression your actions make on society. Like anywhere, again, people are watching, people talk, people remember. North Korean impressions of outsiders are often shaped by only a few interactions. At the same time, you need to pay attention yourself. Often, important information is presented to you in passing. You can't just look it up on your phone later, call about it later, or email. Sometimes you will only have a brief moment alone with your North Korean partner in which you can convey candid information. So you yourself also need to pay attention. Lesson 4, your partners will always be under pressure. The pressure comes from multiple sources. Two which stand out are extreme suspicion and extreme competition in North Korean society. These are 2 quotes which I think are illustrative of these pressures. One is, there are no real friends anymore, and this dates back to the Fire and Fury era, and it shows how just pervasive suspicion can become in North Korean society. The second quote is, money is the most important thing, which reflects how competitive things can become, especially for scarce resources. Indeed, this is a scene from a North Korean movie, A Schoolgirl's Diary, where suddenly two characters who appear to be friends the whole movie turn out to really not like each other. And here is one saying, "Don't be so proud, I can beat you at anything." The reality can be more intense. My impression is that there's a kind of inverse bell curve at work. During bad times, stress and tension goes up due to competition for scarce resources and suspicion as everyone is under more pressure. And surprisingly, the same could be said of the good times, when envy and comparisons can create rivalries across friendships, organizations, or even within ministries. My guess is the curve actually looks a bit more like this, with the challenges of the bad times being much worse than the good times. But still, to do anything, bad or good, or in any direction, there's going to be tension or stress, so you need to remember that. Lesson 5, at the same time, the country is not monolithic. How things work can and does differ across time and space. There are obvious differences between Pyongyang and the rest of the country. There are also differences between urban and rural areas. For example, sensitivity about photography not only differs between Pyongyang and other areas, but it also differs across different provinces. There are subtle differences across regions in terms of linguistics and culture. This map here is just a little diagram of pre-modern regional stereotypes of different provinces in northern Korea. And at the same time, in North Korea, there is a kind of intense individualism. Like people anywhere, North Koreans are the same, but kind of the atomized structure of society sometimes exacerbates these differences between people. The situation is often changing, which means you need to be alert, and you need to think about how these differences may affect your work, especially because of Lesson 6. And Lesson 6 is, in the course of your work, there will always be problems. There will be legal problems, there will be health problems, political problems, logistical problems end up compounding all of the above. Everything is not Hakuna Matata, which means no worries, in case you missed the movie. And this is a little screenshot from the North Korean version of The Lion King. But more seriously, I would argue that even the most experienced practitioners sometimes get overwhelmed on the country. There is too much for any individual to deal with on their own, which again brings us back to this, the importance of having strong relationships with North Korean partners and with each other. So going back to this question, what can we do so that our partners, our projects, and ourselves can carry on safely? The lessons here today are part of an ongoing project of distilling practical knowledge for working inside North Korea. The aim is to kind of prepare a primer to help prepare those inexperienced to work in the operational environment, to avoid repeated mistakes, which in some cases may cost livelihoods or lives, and to share knowledge across individuals, organizations, and generations. Ideally, this would be some kind of living document with regular updates and discussion from different perspectives. Even those of us with a lot of experience in the country don't see the whole picture, like that proverbial blind man in the elephant in the slide. So we need to be able to share, we need to discuss matters, and most of all, we need to be humble. It would also be helpful to work towards some sector-based guides, specifically like for agriculture or public health, and supplement any written materials with scenario-based training in which participants encounter different combinations of problems and have to react to them. So I just want to end this presentation with another quote, also totally unrelated to North Korea, that was said about US Navy preparations for the Pacific War with Japan. And this is, for 2 decades, American officers repeatedly played war games and learned to face different scenarios and combinations of scenarios that they may encounter in the complexity of fighting a war across the Pacific. So the quote is, "It's not that we've done this exact problem, but that we've seen something like it." So I think the same is true for North Korea. You can't prepare for every future circumstance in North Korea, but I think we can continually prepare to problem solve based on some of our previous experiences. And so as we reevaluate, review, and reconnect with North Korea, I think this kind of preparation is a priority in order to make up for lost time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. A very interesting presentation suggesting all the challenges of working at the operational level in North Korea. Thank you very much. And I guess now my challenge is to take what little time I have left for discussion and try and give you enough time to speak as well. So I'm not going to provide a lot of context for my questions. I'm hoping my presenters will understand what I'm talking about when I ask them, and I'm just going to fire right into them. I'll ask kind of a one blanket of questions right now. And the first one just to Dr. Nazanin Cummings. Perhaps if you can very briefly say anything about the current restrictions on humanitarian agencies in North Korea and maybe how sanctions are impacting them. To Dr. Gang, I'd like to give you a chance, maybe if you wanted to elaborate a little bit more, if you could, but also kind of suggest, because we're looking for building foundations with North Korea. So if there's, how can we find, to use a Chairman Kim term, a breakthrough strategy to kind of promote some kind of exchange with North Korea, either at an inter-Korean level or with the international community, that would deal with IT or ICT cooperation in a feasible way, something that we can look for in the future. To Dr. McCarthy, as an environmental expert, I'd like you to draw on your expertise to suggest, maybe, what are some of the other regional models that North Korea could draw on to promote, or that we could draw on to promote collaboration with North Korea in the field of environmental conservation and biodiversity. And finally, to Mr. Banfill, based on your wealth of experience, in today's world right now, in the situation, it's kind of this perfect storm of disconnect. There's ongoing sanctions, there's reduced channels for communication, restricted travel, limited transportation routes, border closures, lack of on-the-ground presence. Now, based on your experience, how did you deal with some of those issues? And maybe if you could cherry pick one situation or something, or how did relationships help you deal with some of the things that many NGOs and people that are looking to engage with North Korea, what we're kind of facing right now? We'll start right there. So we'll go to our Zoom participant first. Nazanin, if you could make some comments quickly.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, quick word on the COVID situation. Many humanitarian aid workers have left the country. I believe IFRC still has staff and concern in some of the UN agencies, but numbers are definitely down, and it's really challenging. I believe almost impossible to leave Pyongyang. So humanitarian reach is really low, and of course that's not only for programming, but also monitoring as well. So that's a major concern. There is some aid, COVID aid going in, PPE, testing kits, but it has to be quarantined for 10 days. And I saw a UNICEF report recently said that they estimate that they're about 5 months behind in programming. And then I saw another report that said, actually, no, everything is fine. So I'm not sure if they were speaking to donor audiences in one and being a bit more perhaps transparent in the other. And also on this issue of sanctions, as I mentioned, there are humanitarian exemptions for sanctions, but these in reality are not sufficient, and humanitarian aid is being heavily impacted by sanctions, particularly secondary sanctions. We've seen NGOs and humanitarian agencies have to leave the country because they cannot do their banking. So I was really interested in hearing from the previous panel, Dr. Novotna's suggestion for INSTEX 2.0. So I hope this is something that the international community will galvanize more support around, because without those banking channels, it's really, really challenging for organizations to do their work. And I'll keep it pretty brief so that we have time for our other participants. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Gong.
Thank you. The thing I did not emphasize enough is how the local markets arising in North Korea, this Changmadang economy, has really made it a point of no return for North Korea, I think. These people making profits in these markets know that there's no turning back. And mobile technology, IT technology has played a great role. Just a good example is, I've heard this from a person, 탈북자, that he had sold his $200 home to buy a $200-something smartphone to do business in the Changmadang. It took him 6 months to make more money and buy himself a $300 home and more. So these experiences are already widely known within North Korean people, and they know that there's no turning back. It's, I think, an issue of now the regime trying to, they understand how this is contributing and supplementing its economy. However, they also want to maintain the control. The regime wants to have control over how it's done. Well, you can't have those two things together. So I think at some point in the future, when these external variables disappear, the UN sanctions and all those political variables, I think it's important to make the leadership aware that digital technology works only under the principle of openness, sharing of information, participation, and wide connectivity with the global community. It's only under these conditions digital technology, IT technology has worked. And this has been proven over and over in our experiences in development consulting for developing countries. So good thing is that this will work, but we will have to get the leadership understand its importance and how that should be channeled towards such goals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. McCarthy. Some models.
Sure. Thanks, Professor Willett. So in light of the recent events across the world, the fires, the floods, the droughts, COVID, all the cascading effects of climate change, it's quite evident that the well-being of the environment is directly connected to the well-being of humans and a foundation for societies to thrive. I believe that protection of the environment will only enhance humanitarian efforts, especially in relation to food security, natural disaster mitigation, public health, and employment. There are plenty of regional examples. Bhutan is an excellent example North Korea can look to as a model for enhancing its environmental conservation while also integrating ecotourism. So one of the pillars of governance in Bhutan is to protect 60% of their forests. They also do a great job in integrating local communities into the management of and share of ecotourism benefits. There are some cautionary tales as well, particularly Mongolia, who has thought it's in their interest to offer up 70% of their land to mining companies, and they're already starting to see the disaster effects on the environment and the impact on traditional livelihoods. Lastly, North Korea can also look to South Korea. South Korea has made exceptional progress in the last 20 years in improving their protected areas. So there are several good practices that North Korea can borrow from and learn from going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. James, last word to you.
I think it's important to focus on what are the realities on the ground and not what we want them to be. There are big gaps between those two things. As Dr. Cummings mentioned, relationships are important to figure out what those gaps are and then solve them. Just briefly, I used to work in tourism, and I like to talk about what I call Friday night problems. And this was a situation where an American NGO was trying to get flight tickets to get into North Korea. This is after they've gotten permission from the State Department. They've gotten permission from the North Korean government. Two bodies which are rather slow in acting. And by the time they got permission for all those things, there are practically no plane tickets left. So nobody thought of that. Nobody's considering that at the higher level. And I think as practitioners working there, we have to kind of lobby to make sure people have a better understanding what the realities are on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much, James. I'm squeezed for time. And I think we've tried to squeeze a lot of things in here, but essentially, the important thing I thought was to give these presenters a platform for at least bringing these topics up. I enjoyed your presentations very much. I would like to continue these hopefully in a later session. Many valuable comments as well. But on that point, I am going to have to close our discussion and this session. Again, I'd like to thank all the panelists that were here today in our conference for their presentations and for their enthusiastic participation. I'd also like to thank Director Iguan Say from the Institute for Far Eastern Studies and Dr. Christian Tax from the Frederick Naumann Foundation for their trust and support of this event. Also a big thanks to the IFAS staff for all their efforts, and especially Ms. Adamsa and Ms. Ruan Mi, Mr. Mo Young Hwan. Also to the technicians from Focus, our company that has taken care of all the technical aspects of this conference. I thank you very much for that, and it's helped it run a lot more smoothly. And finally, thank you, the viewer, for tuning in and for joining us today. You'll see on our webpage there is a Google Docs, or a link to a Google Docs to provide some feedback, your evaluation of this event, and we welcome that a lot. It helps us plan for future events. And I hope you found many of the comments here valuable and worthwhile. So finally, everyone, thank you again. In our current global situation, please stay well, stay healthy, and stay safe. Thank you.